Tasha Williams stepped into the small courthouse with a heavy heart, her hands shaking as she clutched the papers in her lap. She tried to keep her composure, but the weight of the situation pressed on her chest like an unbearable burden. She was a mother of 2 young children and a wife to David Williams, the mayor of the town. But today none of that mattered in the eyes of the law. All that mattered was the charge against her, the robbery of a local jewelry store, a crime she knew she hadn't committed. The rumors swirling around the town had already painted her as guilty. But Tasha knew that was nothing more than prejudice wearing the mask of justice. Her footsteps echoed in the hallway as she made her way into the courtroom. The air was thick with tension. Whispers followed her as she entered the room. Some people were there to support her, others were already convinced of her guilt. But no one knew the truth, not yet, and Tasha was determined to make them listen, even if she was the only one who believed in her innocence. The room fell silent as she took her seat in the defendant's chair. Her eyes flicked over the crowd before landing on the judge. Sitting at the bench, Judge Thomas Green was a man known for his stern demeanor and his swift rulings. He had a reputation for being unyielding, especially when it came to cases involving people of color. And Tasha knew that this trial might be more about his personal biases than about her actual guilt or innocence. He looked at her once, his cold eyes narrowing as if she were already guilty of something, and that feeling of being judged by the very man who was supposed to be impartial sent a chill through her. Her lawyer, Benjamin Cole, a young attorney fresh out of law school, sat next to her, his face pale with nerves. He had never faced a trial like this before, and Tasha could feel the weight of his inexperience on her shoulders. But there was no turning back now. She had to trust him, even if his nervousness was palpable. The prosecutor on the other side of the room was a seasoned veteran. He was confident and ready to make Tasha's life miserable. The trial began with the prosecutor's opening statement outlining the charges against her. He painted her as a cold and calculating criminal who had masterminded the robbery and made off with thousands of dollars worth of jewelry. But his case was built on circumstantial evidence and biased testimonies. Tasha's defense attorney tried to interject, but Judge Green silenced him with a quick motion of his hand. His attention focused solely on the prosecutor, as if Tasha's innocence didn't even matter. Tasha couldn't help but feel like the entire system was working against her. From the moment she had been arrested, everything had moved so quickly. It felt like a nightmare. She couldn't wake up from it. It was as though the very fact of her race made her guilty in the eyes of those who were supposed to protect her. She had always tried to stay out of trouble, to be a good wife and mother. But that didn't seem to matter when it came to the court of public opinion. As she listened to the prosecutor's accusations, she felt a deep sense of frustration rising within her. She wanted to stand up and shout that she was innocent, that she had been wrongfully accused, but she knew that would only make things worse for her. So instead, she sat there in silence, listening to the words that were slowly building a case against her, words that felt like nails in a coffin. She didn't deserve to be in this position. She didn't deserve any of this, but here she was fighting for her life in a courtroom that seemed determined to convict her before she had even spoken a word. Tasha looked at her husband David through the small window of the courtroom door. He hadn't arrived yet, but she hoped he would soon be there to stand by her side, to show the world that her family would fight for her no matter what. Judge Thomas Green sat motionless at the bench, his sharp eyes focused on the proceedings as though he were a mere spectator rather than the one in control. His fingers drummed absent-mindedly on the desk in front of him, the sound echoing throughout the quiet courtroom. Tasha felt a cold shiver run down her spine as she met his gaze for a brief moment. It was the kind of look that told you everything you needed to know without a word spoken. It was a look that said she was already guilty in his eyes even before the trial had begun. The weight of that gaze made her feel smaller than she already was, and it took every ounce of her strength to keep her head high. Benjamin Cole, her defense attorney, sat beside her, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He had tried his best to prepare for this moment, but he could feel the pressure building with every passing second. He knew that Judge Green was known for his quick judgments and harsh sentences, especially toward people of color, and the idea of facing such a man in this kind of trial felt like an uphill battle. But Benjamin couldn't afford to show any weakness. He had to be strong for Tasha, even though doubt gnawed at him from within. The prosecutor stood up to make his case, his voice booming with confidence as he began recounting the details of the robbery. He painted Tasha as a ruthless criminal, a mastermind who had planned the robbery with precision and cunning. He spoke of the stolen jewelry, the stolen life, as though Tasha were just another criminal on a long list of offenders. But Tasha knew this was far from the truth. There was no evidence to support the accusations. They had no fingerprints, no solid proof that she had even been at the scene of the crime. But the prosecutor's words were smooth and calculated, designed to sway the jury and the judge into seeing her as guilty before she had a chance to speak for herself. As he continued his monologue, Tasha felt her stomach churn with frustration. She couldn't let this man continue to paint her as something she wasn't, but she knew better than to interrupt. She had to remain silent and wait for her moment to speak. But with every passing minute, she felt the walls closing in on her. The courtroom felt like it was spinning out of control, and she was powerless to stop it. Judge Green's expression remained unreadable as he listened to the prosecutor's words. Tasha couldn't help but notice how the judge seemed to give the prosecutor far more attention than he had given her defense attorney. Even as Benjamin tried to ask questions or present evidence, the judge would dismiss him with a wave of his hand or a sharp remark. It was as if he didn't care to hear anything that contradicted the narrative the prosecutor was building. Tasha tried to focus on the trial, but her thoughts kept drifting to her children back home and her husband David. She could only imagine what he was doing right now. He had no idea what was happening in this room. He was busy with his mayoral duties, trying to keep the town running smoothly, but she knew he would never forgive himself for not being here for her now. The thought of him finding out about her trial and the possibility of him walking into this courtroom to see her accused of a crime she didn't commit made her heart ache. The sound of the judge's voice broke her train of thought as he called for a short recess. Tasha's hands gripped the arms of her chair as she tried to steady herself. She had to be strong. She had to hold on, even when everything around her felt like it was slipping away. This was far from over, she told herself. But as she looked around the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late. Tasha's mind raced as the courtroom emptied for the short recess. She sat frozen in her chair, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in on her like a suffocating fog. Her hands were clammy as she twisted them in her lap, unsure of what to do next. She tried to focus on her breathing, but every inhale felt shallow, as if the air itself had thickened around her. The prosecution's case was airtight in their eyes. It had already decided her fate, and the judge's bias only seemed to cement their belief that she was guilty. The defense attorney Benjamin Cole sat next to her, his brow furrowed in concentration as he flipped through his notes, his nervous energy palpable. Tasha could feel his tension radiating off of him, as if he too was trying to hold on to whatever hope they still had. As the recess dragged on, Tasha's thoughts turned inward. She replayed the events of the robbery over and over in her head. The night she was accused of committing the crime had been a blur. She had been at home with her children tucked safely into bed, while her husband David was out attending a town meeting. She knew she hadn't been anywhere near the jewelry store that night, but no one seemed to believe her, no one except for her family who stood by her side. But even their faith in her seemed futile in the face of the evidence stacked against her, the false witness testimony, the biased police reports, the assumptions made because of her race. All of it had converged to paint her as a criminal in the eyes of the world. The thought of her children brought a fresh wave of despair to her chest. She couldn't bear to think of them growing up without their mother, or worse, growing up in a world that saw them the same way it saw her. Their innocence was a fragile thing, and the injustice she was facing now felt like it could destroy everything they had ever known about fairness and right and wrong. Her attention snapped back to the moment as Benjamin cleared his throat and leaned in closer to her, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tasha," he said, "we need to start preparing your defense more thoroughly. We can't rely on just questioning their witnesses. We need something concrete to prove your innocence, something that the judge can't just dismiss out of hand." Tasha nodded numbly, though she wasn't sure what they could do. They had already presented the alibi evidence. Her location had been verified by her neighbors who had seen her at home that night, but Judge Green had dismissed their testimonies as irrelevant and biased against the prosecution's case. Tasha felt herself slipping further into despair, but she knew she had to hold on for her children, for David, for herself. She couldn't let the judge and the system break her. The courtroom doors creaked open, signaling the end of the recess and the return of the proceedings. Tasha's heart pounded as she straightened in her chair, bracing herself for the next round of the trial. She could already hear the murmurs of the crowd as they filed back into the room, the weight of their eyes heavy upon her, like a constant reminder that she was being judged not for the crime she was accused of, but for who she was. The judge returned to his seat, his expression as cold and unreadable as ever. Tasha couldn't shake the feeling that he had already decided the outcome of this trial long before it had begun. Benjamin gave her a reassuring glance, but it did little to ease the knot in her stomach. She knew that every word she said from here on out would be scrutinized under a magnifying glass, and that every piece of evidence would be twisted to fit the narrative that had already been set in motion. She tried to steady herself, but doubt crept in, threatening to drown her as the trial continued, and she realized how alone she truly was in that moment, how little control she had over the events unfolding around her. The trial resumed with a sense of heaviness in the air. The prosecutor stood with a smug smile on his face as he called the next witness to the stand. Edma, a neighbor who lived a few doors down from Tasha's house, stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the wooden floor as she made her way to the witness box. Tasha couldn't help but feel a wave of dread wash over her as Edna took her seat. Edna had always been outspoken and often made comments about Tasha that rubbed her the wrong way. She had never been anything more than polite to Edna, but the woman had made it clear in passing conversations that she didn't exactly approve of Tasha's presence in the neighborhood. Tasha had never thought much of it at the time, but now in the courtroom with Edna about to testify, it felt like a whole new level of danger had just entered the room. Edna's voice rang out as she began recounting her version of the events on the night of the robbery. She claimed to have seen Tasha walking down the street near the jewelry store around the time of the crime. She spoke with certainty, as if she had witnessed the scene herself. Every word that left her lips felt like an accusation that chipped away at Tasha's dignity with each passing sentence. The more Edna spoke, the more Tasha's stomach turned. She had never been anywhere near the jewelry store that night. She had been at home with her children. But Edna's words were so sure, so confident, that it made everything Tasha knew to be true feel like it was slipping away. Judge Green leaned forward slightly, listening intently to Edna's testimony, his eyes never leaving her, as if he found her account entirely believable. Tasha could feel the shift in the room as the judge gave Edna his full attention while Benjamin struggled to interrupt and question the witness. Every time he tried to ask a follow-up question, Judge Green shot him down with a sharp command to let the witness speak. It felt like the scales were tipping in the prosecution's favor, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Benjamin finally stood up when Edna finished speaking and began to cross-examine her, his voice steady, but clearly tinged with frustration. He questioned her about the clarity of her memory, the possibility of mistaken identity, but Edna remained steadfast in her statements, her confidence unwavering. It was as if she knew her word would be taken as truth simply because of who she was in the community, a respectable woman who lived a few houses down from the crime scene. The implication was clear. She was believed simply because she was white and Tasha was black. The very idea that Tasha could be innocent seemed laughable to those in the room who had already decided her guilt. Tasha's frustration grew with every minute that passed. It felt like she was fighting against an invisible tide that was pushing her further into the depths of despair. Nothing she said or did would matter in a room that had already made up its mind. She could feel the eyes of the jury on her now. Many of them had grown quiet and tense as Edna spoke, and it was clear that their judgment was being swayed by the simple act of hearing her testimony. Even though it was filled with holes, the idea of a black woman committing such a crime seemed to fit neatly into the narrative they had already constructed in their minds. Judge Green's eyes flickered over to Tasha for just a moment before he returned his attention to the witness box, his cold gaze sending a chill through her. She could feel the weight of his judgment pressing down on her, and it was all she could do to keep from breaking down in front of the entire courtroom. She had come to this place believing that the truth would set her free, but now she was beginning to wonder if the truth even mattered in a system so built on preconceived notions and racial biases. As the cross-examination ended, Judge Green wasted no time in calling for the next witness. Tasha's heart sank as the prosecutor stood up to introduce a new piece of evidence. It was a blurry security camera photo showing a figure wearing a hoodie and a face mask outside the jewelry store. The image was indistinct, but the prosecutor was quick to claim that the figure resembled Tasha. Even though the details were far from clear, he pointed to the photo and made a bold declaration that it was proof of her involvement in the robbery. The image seemed to hang in the air like a specter that only served to deepen the suspicion already clouding the courtroom. Benjamin quickly objected to the photo's relevance. He argued that the quality of the image was too poor to make any definitive identification, and that it was unreasonable to accuse someone based solely on such flimsy evidence. But Judge Green barely seemed to acknowledge the objection. He allowed the photo to stand as part of the evidence, and Tasha could feel the walls closing in tighter around her every second. She could hear the prosecutor speaking in his usual smooth voice as he made his case, but it all felt distant and disconnected to her. Her mind was reeling from the impact of the false witness testimony. The photograph, the way every shred of doubt she had was being stripped away by the very people who were supposed to uphold justice. As the prosecutor continued his relentless push against her, Benjamin stood up again, attempting to question the credibility of the security footage. He pointed out that the store had been known for poor surveillance equipment, and that there were no clear markers to indicate that the person in the photo was her. But again, Judge Green gave him no quarter. His eyes were fixed on the screen in front of him, as if he had already decided that this was a pivotal piece of evidence and nothing would change his mind. Tasha couldn't help but feel that no matter how much her attorney fought to show her innocence, the judge had already made up his mind. It was as if the deck had been stacked against her from the very beginning. Tasha tried to keep her emotions in check, but it was becoming harder with each passing moment. Her heart raced as she glanced at the jury. Their faces were a mixture of skepticism and suspicion. Some of them avoided her gaze, while others seemed to study her every movement with an air of judgment as though they were already sure of her guilt. It was in their eyes, their body language, the way they leaned forward in their seats, the way they whispered to each other. When the prosecutor spoke, it was as if they had already condemned her, and the trial was just a formality to justify the outcome. The feeling of helplessness grew stronger inside her. She had never felt more alone in her life. It was as if she had been cast adrift in a sea of accusations and misjudgments with no lifeline in sight. The weight of the trial was crushing her. Her thoughts kept spiraling back to her family, David, her children. She could barely keep herself together long enough to hold on to the hope that they would believe in her, that they would see through the lies being spun against her. But in this moment, it felt like the world was against her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Benjamin finally finished his objections and sat down beside her with a grim look on his face. Tasha could see the exhaustion in his eyes. He was fighting a battle he wasn't sure he could win, and it was taking a toll on him too. As the trial dragged on, she felt more and more like an outsider in a place that was supposed to offer justice, but instead only seemed to be offering her punishment. Tasha closed her eyes for a brief moment, trying to summon the strength to keep going, but when she opened them again, she saw the face of the prosecutor smirking as he turned away from the jury. The case against her was only getting stronger, and all she could do was watch as the story of her innocence unraveled before her eyes. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the trial continued. Tasha sat rigid in her chair, every nerve on edge. As the prosecutor launched into his next line of attack, he called forth another witness. This time it was a police officer, Detective Harper, a man who had been involved in the investigation from the beginning. Tasha could see the way the detective carried himself with authority, his uniform pressed perfectly, his posture rigid with pride. He walked to the witness stand and sat down as if he were already preparing to deliver the final blow to her defense. Tasha's heart sank as she remembered the night of her arrest. She could still see the harsh lights of the police car in her rearview mirror, the cold handcuffs snapping shut around her wrists, the way everything had unfolded so quickly and with such certainty against her. Detective Harper began his testimony by recounting the events that had led to Tasha's arrest. He spoke with calm confidence about how she had been found near the scene of the crime on the night of the robbery, though he failed to mention that he had stopped her, not because she was a suspect, but because she was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. He claimed that she had been acting suspiciously, her movements unsteady, as though she were trying to avoid being seen. But Tasha knew that was a lie. She had been walking home from a neighbor's house after helping her friend with a family emergency. There was nothing suspicious about it, but the detective's words painted a very different picture, one that suggested guilt without any actual evidence to back it up. Benjamin stood to cross-examine the detective, his voice steady, but Tasha could hear the frustration underlying every word he spoke. He asked about the specifics of the investigation, about the lack of concrete evidence linking her to the crime scene. But Detective Harper was quick to dismiss any doubts with practiced ease. He insisted that Tasha's presence near the store was enough to raise suspicion, even though there was no proof she had committed the robbery. He spoke as though the fact that she was black in a predominantly white neighborhood had somehow made her more likely to be a criminal, as though her mere existence was reason enough to accuse her of a crime she didn't commit. Tasha's stomach twisted with each passing second. The feeling of being trapped in a web of lies and assumptions was overwhelming. She wanted to scream, to say something, to tell everyone in the room that she was innocent, but she knew that would only make things worse. The system was already rigged against her, and no matter how much she tried to fight it, no matter how much she tried to prove her innocence, it seemed as though the more she struggled, the tighter the noose became. Judge Green watched the exchange with disinterest, barely offering any objections or guidance to the proceedings, as if he were simply a bystander, rather than the one responsible for ensuring fairness in the trial. Tasha could feel his gaze occasionally flicker in her direction, his cold eyes never giving her a sense of reassurance. No matter how hard she tried to read them, she could only see the same detached indifference that had been present since the beginning of the trial. It was as if her life didn't matter to him, as though she was just another case to be handled and dismissed without a second thought. As the detective's testimony came to an end, Tasha felt a knot form in her throat. She had expected the trial to be difficult, but the way it was unfolding felt like a nightmare. She couldn't wake up from everything she had hoped for. Every ounce of faith she had placed in the justice system was being shattered piece by piece, and with every word spoken by the prosecution, every testimony offered by the witnesses, the more it seemed like she had no hope left. The world outside this courtroom seemed so distant now, and all she could do was sit there waiting for the inevitable weight of the verdict that loomed over her. As the detective's testimony came to a close, the courtroom felt suffocatingly still. Tasha's heart hammered in her chest, but she tried to keep her composure. She looked around the room, feeling the weight of the eyes on her, the jury, the spectators, a prosecutor, all of them seemed to be waiting for the moment when her fate would be sealed. Judge Green seemed utterly indifferent, his gaze barely lingering on her. As the trial moved forward, Tasha could hear Benjamin's voice as he prepared for the next phase of the trial, but his words seemed distant to her, as if the room had grown muffled and far away. She couldn't shake the sense that the trial was no longer about the truth. It had become a performance where the outcome had already been decided, and she was just an unfortunate player, caught in the middle of it all. Benjamin stood to speak in her defense, but Tasha could feel the tremor in his voice. His usual confidence had been replaced by a quiet frustration. He was doing his best to fight for her, but she knew it was becoming harder and harder to do so in the face of overwhelming odds. Tasha tried to focus on his words, but the strain in his voice made it clear that even he was losing hope. He pointed out once again that the evidence was circumstantial and that nothing tied her to the robbery, but Judge Green barely responded to his arguments. He simply nodded in acknowledgement and motioned for the next witness to take the stand. The next witness was another member of the community, a woman named Patricia, who had known Tasha for years. She was a quiet woman who lived a few blocks away and had always been supportive of Tasha. In the past, Patricia was one of the few people who had offered to testify on Tasha's behalf, but Tasha had a sinking feeling in her stomach as she saw the woman step forward. Her nervous eyes darted around the room as she was sworn in, and then she began to speak. Her voice was trembling as she recounted the night of the robbery, but the more she spoke, the more Tasha realized that Patricia was stumbling over her words. She didn't seem sure of anything she said. The details were vague and unclear, and as Patricia tried to recount Tasha's alibi for that night, her story faltered. The things she said didn't quite line up with what Tasha had told her earlier. Patricia was trying to help, but it seemed that the pressure of the trial was making it harder for her to remember the truth with clarity. Tasha's anxiety rose as she watched Patricia's testimony unravel. She wanted to stand up and tell the court that Patricia was simply nervous, but the damage was already being done with every word that came out of Patricia's mouth. The cracks in her alibi seemed to widen, the doubt creeping into the minds of the jury and the judge. It felt like another blow to her already fragile defense, and Tasha couldn't help but wonder if anyone in the room was truly listening to her side of the story, or if they were simply waiting for her to break under the pressure. Benjamin tried to salvage the situation, but his questions only seemed to make Patricia more flustered. He asked her about the specific details of that night, the exact time she had seen Tasha at home, the exact events she had witnessed, but Patricia couldn't answer him with confidence. She stammered and apologized again and again, as if she were the one on trial instead of Tasha. Judge Green watched this all unfold with an air of indifference, his face unreadable as the woman fumbled through her testimony. He didn't seem to care that Patricia was struggling. He didn't seem to care that the defense was falling apart in front of him. It felt like the entire room was closing in on Tasha, and no matter how much she tried to hold on to her hope or her belief in justice, she was slowly being swallowed by the overwhelming weight of the situation. Tasha sat there feeling numb to everything around her. The sounds of the courtroom faded into a blur, and all she could hear was the pounding of her own heart as the pieces of her defense continued to slip away one by one. With each moment that passed, it seemed like there was less and less to hold on to, and the reality of her situation began to sink in. The courtroom was thick with tension as Patricia's testimony came to an end, and Tasha felt a deep sinking sensation in her chest, like a weight pressing her down. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to steady herself, but the hopelessness of the situation began to suffocate her. The defense was unraveling with each passing second, and Tasha could feel the walls closing in faster than she could fight back. The judge's indifference was like a cold wave crashing over her, and she began to wonder if anyone in the room had ever intended to hear her side of the story, or if it had all been decided from the beginning that she was guilty. Benjamin looked at her with a grim expression, his usual optimism gone, and Tasha could see the defeat in his eyes. Even though he tried to mask it, he knew as well as she did that the evidence wasn't enough to save her, at least not in the eyes of the judge and the jury. They were too wrapped up in their assumptions to see the truth that she was a mother, caught in a storm of lies and prejudice. The prosecutor stood to address the jury, his voice smooth and calculating. As he delivered his closing arguments, he painted a picture of Tasha as a cold and calculating criminal who had orchestrated the robbery with precision. He spoke of the stolen goods and the damage done to the community as if Tasha were the mastermind behind it all, as if she had done something unforgivable, when all she had done was be in the wrong place at the wrong time. He twisted the facts to suit his narrative, and with every word he spoke it felt like the weight of the world was pressing down harder on Tasha's chest. She could hardly bear to listen, but she couldn't look away. She had to endure it, even though every word seemed like a dagger being driven deeper into her soul. Tasha's thoughts drifted again to her family, to David and their children. She imagined their faces as they heard about the trial and the accusations against her. She could already see their confusion, their heartbreak. How could they understand? How could they know what she was going through? When no one seemed to believe in her anymore, David would be so angry and so devastated, but there was nothing she could do to fix it. She couldn't explain the pain. She was feeling the weight of the injustice that was crushing her, because it seemed like no one was listening. Benjamin stood to offer the defense's closing remarks, but Tasha could tell it was more out of obligation than hope. He spoke with conviction, but his voice lacked the strength it had in the beginning. It felt like an echo of something that had already been lost. He pleaded for the jury to look beyond the lies, to see her for who she truly was, a loving mother, a woman who had no business being dragged into a trial like this. But his words seemed to hang in the air without any real impact, as if they were swallowed by the weight of the prosecutor's case. Judge Green remained a cold figure throughout it all. His expression never changed and his eyes never softened toward Tasha. It was as though he were simply waiting for the show to end so he could deliver the inevitable verdict. Tasha felt a cold sweat break out on her skin, and she struggled to keep her composure. She wanted to scream, to stand up and tell everyone that they were wrong, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. The moment wasn't hers to control anymore. Everything was slipping. As the jury filed out of the courtroom, Tasha sat motionless in her seat, her hands trembling in her lap. She tried to steady her breathing, but each inhale felt more difficult than the last. The courtroom seemed to fade away around her as she stared blankly at the empty chair where the jury had just sat. It felt like an eternity in that silence. Every second stretched into what felt like hours, and the weight of it pressed down on her chest. She knew that what happened next could change her life forever, but no matter how much she braced herself for it, she couldn't prepare for the possibility that her worst fears would come true. Benjamin sat beside her, his face tired and drawn. He kept glancing over at the door where the jury had exited, as though he were waiting for a miracle, but the truth was that they had no miracles left to offer. Tasha could see the doubt in his eyes, and it mirrored her own. He had fought hard for her, but there was only so much he could do against the tide of prejudice and false evidence that had been stacked against her. No matter how much he had tried to poke holes in the prosecutor's case, the jury had already been swayed by their biases, and the judge's indifference had only made things worse. Tasha wondered if anyone in the room had ever truly believed in her innocence, or if they had just been going through the motions. She thought about David and the children again, wondering what they were doing now. Had they been following the trial? Had they heard the lies being told about her? Did they know how close she was to losing everything she had worked so hard for? Every thought felt like a knife twisting in her stomach. But it was the thought of her children that cut the deepest, the thought of them growing up in a world where the color of her skin had already condemned her to a fate she didn't deserve. The door to the jury room creaked open, and Tasha's heart skipped a beat as the foreman stepped into the room, his face unreadable. As he walked to the front of the courtroom, there was a heavy silence as everyone waited for the verdict. The air felt thick with anticipation, as though the room were holding its breath, waiting for the final judgment to fall. Judge Green motioned for the foreman to approach the bench, and the courtroom held its collective breath as the foreman read the verdict. The words seemed to echo in Tasha's ears, but they felt distant, as if they were coming from a faraway place. She heard the word guilty, and her world seemed to shatter. The word lingered in her mind like a death sentence, a sentence she had never deserved. But there it was, plain as day. She had been found guilty of a crime she didn't commit, and the judge's face remained cold and unreadable as he prepared to pass down her punishment. Tasha couldn't breathe for a moment as the words sank in. She felt the world around her spin and tilt as if the ground beneath her had just crumbled away. The trial had been a blur of accusations and lies, but now it was real. The weight of it all crashed into her with the force of a freight train, and she struggled to make sense of it. She wanted to shout, she wanted to scream, to demand that someone listen to her, but her voice seemed to be lost in the overwhelming flood of emotion that swept through her. Benjamin reached over and placed a hand on her shoulder, his face showing a mixture of sorrow and anger. But Tasha couldn't bring herself to look at him. She couldn't look at anyone. She just stared ahead, her vision blurred with tears, her mind a whirlwind of disbelief and fear. She had been betrayed by a system that was supposed to protect her. She had been condemned, not for a crime she had committed, but for the color of her skin. And she couldn't escape it. She couldn't escape the fact that everything she had worked for, everything she had ever believed in, had been taken from her in the blink of an eye. The courtroom erupted into a hushed murmur as Judge Green readied himself to announce the sentencing. Tasha's chest tightened with each passing second. Her mind couldn't process the words she had just heard. The finality of the guilty verdict had left her reeling. She could barely comprehend what was happening around her. All she could hear was the pounding of her own heartbeat in her ears. Benjamin's voice seemed distant as he leaned toward her to offer words of comfort, but they were hollow. The weight of the verdict had crushed any hope she had left. The walls of the courtroom seemed to close in on her, and for a moment she felt like she couldn't breathe. Judge Green's voice broke through her thoughts as he began to speak, his tone impassive. As he laid out the details of her sentence, Tasha could feel the coldness in his words, each syllable carrying more weight than the last. He spoke of the years she would serve for the crime she had been convicted of, and Tasha's heart sank deeper into her chest. With every word, the numbers seemed meaningless to her now. They were just empty symbols in a world where justice no longer had any meaning. The sentence was harsh and unrelenting, and as the judge finished speaking, Tasha's vision blurred. She tried to stay composed, but her hands were shaking violently beneath the table, and her breath came in ragged gasps. The courtroom was still for a moment before a wave of murmurs rippled through the audience, and the tension in the air grew heavier. With each passing second, Benjamin was on his feet, once more trying to argue for a lesser sentence, his voice pleading, but Judge Green was unmoved, his eyes cold and distant as he shot down every attempt at mercy. The words felt like a blur to Tasha. They were just noises in the background of her panic. She couldn't focus on anything except the fact that she was being ripped away from her family, from the life she had known. As the bailiffs began to move toward her to escort her out of the courtroom, Tasha could barely process what was happening. The thought of being dragged away from everything she had ever loved was unbearable. She had imagined this moment for days, but now that it was here, it felt like a nightmare she couldn't escape. She glanced toward the back of the room where her family was sitting, but all she could see were the blurred faces of strangers. She wanted to scream out to them, to beg them to help her, but the words wouldn't come. She was numb to everything around her. Her body felt like it had been drained of all its strength. Benjamin walked beside her as the bailiffs led her out of the courtroom, his face etched with frustration and helplessness. He had fought so hard for her, but now it felt like the battle was over, and she had lost. She wanted to reach out and grab his hand to hold onto the last thread of hope she had, but her body felt heavy, and the weight of the world was pressing down on her shoulders. She felt like she was being swallowed whole by the injustice that had been thrust upon her, and all she could do was walk forward one step at a time as the cold handcuffs tightened around her wrists. As the doors to the courtroom swung shut behind her, Tasha felt a sense of finality wash over her. The sound of the doors closing seemed to echo in her mind, a reminder that she was now on a path she couldn't turn back from. Her life had been taken from her, and all she could do was brace for the unknown future ahead. The thought of being locked away in prison seemed unfathomable, but it was becoming more and more real with every passing moment, and she wondered if she would ever feel the warmth of the sun on her face again, or if she would be lost in a place where the truth no longer mattered. The drive to the holding facility felt like an eternity for Tasha. Each mile that passed seemed to stretch out endlessly, as if she were being carried further and further from the life she had known, the life she had fought so hard to protect. The air inside the van felt suffocating, and her thoughts were scattered like broken pieces of glass. She couldn't bring herself to focus on anything in particular. The guilt of the trial, the cold indifference of the judge, and the pain of being torn away from her children all blurred together into a weight she couldn't escape. The sound of the tires against the pavement was the only thing that anchored her to reality, but even that felt distant, like the world outside the van had become a hollow echo she couldn't reach. Benjamin had stayed by her side through it all, but now he was gone. His last words of encouragement had been lost in the whirlwind of the trial, and his attempts to offer hope had faded into the background as Tasha was swept away by the harshness of the sentence. He had fought so hard that in the end it wasn't enough. No one could have been enough, not in a system that was already determined to see her fail. The journey seemed to take forever, and with each passing minute the finality of it all settled deeper into Tasha's bones. She had spent days imagining what this moment would feel like, but nothing could have prepared her for the brutal reality of being driven away from everything she loved. The weight of her guilt felt unbearable, but it was overshadowed by the realization that her life had been reduced to a sentence written on a piece of paper. and that there was no escape from it, no way to fight against the decision that had been made, no way to turn back time and undo the mistakes that had led her here. When they finally arrived at the facility, Tasha was ushered out of the van and into the cold concrete building. Her heart raced in her chest as the doors slammed behind her, a sharp sound that reverberated through her body. The stark, sterile walls around her seemed to close in, and for a moment she felt like she was suffocating in the emptiness of it all. She could hear the clattering of keys and the metallic sound of doors being unlocked, but all of it felt distant, like she was moving through a dream that she couldn't wake up from. The officers led her down a long corridor, and Tasha could feel the cold air against her skin as she was pushed forward toward a small, dimly lit room where she would be processed. Her body was numb, her mind disconnected from the reality of what was happening to her. She had never imagined that it would come to this. She had never thought that the system would turn its back on her so completely, and yet here she was locked in a place where no one seemed to care what had brought her here, or who she really was. All that mattered was the charge, the conviction, and the sentence that had already been handed down. As the officers took her fingerprints and photographed her, Tasha felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had heard the horror stories of life inside prison, but it wasn't the fear of what awaited her that shook her to the core. It was the deep sense of betrayal that gnawed at her, the realization that the world she had trusted had failed her, and that there was no one left to fight for her freedom. The thought of her children, of David, of the life she had been robbed of, filled her with an aching emptiness that she couldn't shake, and for the first time since the trial began she allowed herself to break down. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she thought of them and the cruel injustice she had been forced to endure. They didn't seem to notice the tears or the pain in her eyes as they moved her to another room and began to strip her of her clothes, her dignity slowly slipping away piece by piece. She had been reduced to just another prisoner, another statistic in a system that had no place for people like her, and she couldn't help but wonder if she would ever escape it, if she would ever be allowed to reclaim the life that had been stolen from her. The cold metal door slammed shut behind Tasha with a finality that left her breathless. She stood in the small, sparse cell staring at the bare walls, her mind spinning with the overwhelming reality of her situation. The sound of the door locking echoed in her ears, and for a moment she couldn't move, she couldn't breathe. It was as though the entire world had collapsed around her, leaving her in a place so foreign, so utterly alien, that she felt as though she were no longer herself, but a shadow of who she had once been. The world outside seemed so far away, and now she could no longer see her children or David, no longer hear their voices or feel the warmth of their love. The only thing left was the cold, unyielding silence of her new reality. Tasha sank onto the hard, narrow cot that sat against the wall, the thin mattress offering little comfort. She curled into herself, wrapping her arms around her knees as the tears began to fall again. They came in waves, at first tentative, then uncontrollable, each tear a reminder of everything she had lost, the life she had worked so hard for, the family she had devoted herself to, the dream of a future that now seemed so distant, so unattainable. All of it was slipping through her fingers like sand, and she couldn't stop it. She wanted to scream, to demand that someone listen to her, that someone believe her, but the words caught in her throat, and all she could do was sit there alone in the silence, letting the sorrow wash over her. Her mind drifted back to the courtroom, the cold gaze of Judge Green, the way the prosecutor's words had twisted the truth into something unrecognizable, the faces of the jury who had sentenced her without hesitation, without ever truly seeing her. Tasha could still hear their voices in her head, each one accusing her of a crime she hadn't committed, and in that moment it felt as though the entire world was complicit in her punishment, as though the truth had been buried so deeply that no one could see it anymore, no one except her. She reached up to touch the rough, concrete walls as if she could somehow make them crumble away and reveal a way out, but there was no way out here, no way to escape the system that had locked her in its grip. Tasha could feel the weight of her new life pressing down on her shoulders, each breath a struggle against the suffocating darkness that seemed to be closing in on her. But even in the midst of it all, there was a small flicker of something deep inside her, a spark of defiance that refused to be snuffed out entirely. It was fragile, but it was there, and Tasha clung to it with all her strength. She wouldn't let this place take everything from her. She wouldn't let the world's cruelty destroy her spirit. She would find a way to survive no matter how hard it became. Outside her cell, the sounds of the prison hummed softly in the background, the occasional footsteps of guards, the distant clank of metal doors, and the low murmur of other prisoners. But inside her mind it was silent, save for the sound of her own heartbeat thumping in her chest. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself drift into the memory of her family, their faces, her children's laughter, their voices calling to her. It felt like a dream now, a memory that seemed so distant that it was hard to believe it had ever been real. But in the quiet of her cell, as the reality of her punishment began to settle over her, Tasha promised herself that no matter how long it took, she would fight to get back to them. She would fight for her children, for her husband, and for the life that had been stolen from her. No matter the obstacles, no matter how hopeless it seemed, she would not let herself be broken. Not here, not now, and not ever. She had survived this much, and she would survive more no matter how dark the path ahead became. She would not let the shadows swallow her whole. The days in prison blurred into one another like a long stretch of gray. Tasha had lost count of the weeks, the months, the hours spent staring at the same concrete walls, the same metal bars. Her life had become a monotonous rhythm of cold meals and empty conversations with other prisoners who seemed just as lost as she was. But in the quietest moments, in the solitude of her cell, she could still feel the flicker of something inside her, a defiance, a fire that refused to die. No matter how much the system tried to crush it, she held onto that spark like a lifeline, knowing that one day it would be enough to break through the darkness that surrounded her. Her thoughts often drifted back to her family, to David and the kids. Their faces filled her mind when she closed her eyes, and though the ache of missing them never went away, it also fueled her determination to survive. She thought of them every day and every night as she lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if they had given up on her, if they had moved on with their lives and left her behind. The thought broke her heart, but it also pushed her to keep going, because she couldn't let them believe that she had given up on them. She couldn't let them think she was defeated, not when there was so much left to fight for. One day, as Tasha walked the prison yard, her eyes caught sight of a familiar face in the distance. At first, she thought it was a mirage, but as the person drew closer, her heart skipped a beat. It was David, standing by the chain-link fence outside the visiting area. Tasha's breath caught in her throat, her legs felt weak, but she forced herself to move forward. Her mind raced with 1,000 questions, but all she could do was stand there as he reached through the bars, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and love. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her as if trying to memorize her face, as if he couldn't believe she was standing there in front of him. Tasha's hands trembled as she reached out to him, but the metal bars between them separated them too much, and all she could do was grasp at the air between them, the longing in her chest almost unbearable. David finally spoke, his voice cracking as he whispered her name, and Tasha couldn't hold back the tears anymore. They came in a rush, hot and uncontrollable, as she pressed her forehead against the cold metal, wishing she could close the distance between them. "I never stopped believing in you," David said, his voice barely above a whisper, and Tasha's heart swelled with a mix of relief and sorrow. "I've been fighting for you every day, and I'll keep fighting no matter what they say, no matter what happens. We'll get you out of here. You're not alone." The words felt like a balm to her broken spirit, like a promise that the world hadn't completely abandoned her. Maybe the system had tried to erase her, maybe the world had turned its back on her, but David hadn't. He hadn't given up on her, and that was all she needed to hear. The visit was brief, but it gave Tasha something she hadn't had in a long time: hope. She walked back to her cell that day with a renewed sense of purpose, a fire rekindled within her. She knew the battle wasn't over, it would never be over, but she had a reason to keep fighting now. She had a reason to keep breathing, and no matter how long it took, no matter how many obstacles stood in her way, she would never give up on the fight to reclaim her life and her freedom. The truth would eventually come to light. She would see to it. She would fight for it with everything she had, because she knew now more than ever that justice had a way of finding its way to the surface, even if it took years, even if it took a lifetime.